We can see the tension almost daily in Donald Trump's policy toward Iran. One social media post threatens to destroy Iranian civilization and bring an end to 47 years of evil. Another one that same day speaks of the progress being made in negotiations with Iran. Trump enters negotiations and seems optimistic about a deal with Iran, and in between rounds starts a war with Tehran and urges Iranians to overthrow their government. Less than a week later, he's back to promising that if they agree to his demands, Iran will have a very bright future,
You wake up, check the headlines, and suddenly a mission called Project Freedom has already been paused. Not because the Strait of Hormuz stopped mattering, not because the ships were suddenly safe, not because Iran had surrendered control of the waterway, but because a U.S. operation that sounded simple on paper ran straight into the hard limits of regional power. In May 2026, Donald Trump announced Project Freedom. The mission was framed as humanitarian. America would help guide stranded ships out of the Strait of Hormuz. Neutral ships. Innocent crews. Commercial vessels trapped in a war they did not start. That was the headline. But what happened next changed the story completely. Because within roughly 48 hours, the mission was paused. And the pause did not just slow down an operation. It exposed the structure underneath it. Military access. Saudi hesitation. Pakistani mediation. South Korean caution. Chinese and Russian resistance at the United Nations. Iran's control over risk. And the limits of American power inside one of the most important waterways on Earth. So this stopped being just a story about ships. It became a story about leverage. Who controls Hormuz? Who can open it? Who can block it? And what happens when the biggest navy in the world still needs the region to move with it? Let's break this down carefully, because the official story sounded clean. Project Freedom was supposed to support commercial ships seeking safe transit through the Strait of Hormuz. CENTCOM said the mission was about restoring freedom of navigation in an essential international trade corridor. That language sounded defensive. It sounded legal. It sounded humanitarian. But note this carefully. In Hormuz, support is not a small word. Support can mean intelligence. Support can mean surveillance. Support can mean air cover. Support can mean guided missile destroyers. Support can mean unmanned platforms. It can mean military force close enough to confrontation. And according to CENTCOM, the operation involved guided missile destroyers, more than 100 land and sea-based aircraft, unmanned platforms, and about 15,000 service members. So this was not just a few boats guiding cargo ships through a difficult passage. This was a military shield placed over one of the world's most sensitive choke points. And that is when the humanitarian story began to collide with the military reality. Trump framed the mission as a humanitarian gesture. Ships were stuck. Crews needed supplies. Companies and countries that had nothing to do with the conflict needed a way out. That part mattered. Because there really were commercial vessels trapped inside a dangerous maritime crisis. But this is where things get complicated. A humanitarian mission can still function as a power move. And in the Strait of Hormuz, an escort is never just an escort. To Washington, it looked like rescue. To ship owners, it looked like survival. To oil markets, it looked like reassurance. But to Iran, it could look like intrusion. And once Iran saw it that way, the mission changed. It was no longer only about moving ships. It became about who had authority in the strait. Who decided which vessels could move, which corridor was safe, whether Iran's blockade could hold, and who had the power to turn a restricted waterway back into a functioning trade route? That was the real question. Not whether the ships needed help. They did. The question was who had the right and the power to help them. Now hold on. To understand why Project Freedom became so dangerous, we have to understand Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrow passage on a map. It is one of the pressure points of the global economy. In normal times, about 1/5 of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas moves through this waterway. So when Hormuz becomes unstable, the world feels it fast. Oil traders watch. Shipping companies hesitate. Insurance costs rise. Asian importers worry. Gulf producers calculate losses. And ordinary people eventually feel the pressure through fuel, food, transport, and inflation. That is why Project Freedom was never only about ships. It was about confidence. It was about telling markets that America could still keep global commerce moving. It was about telling allies that Washington could still protect the sea lanes. And it was about telling Iran that it could not turn the world's most sensitive energy corridor into a pressure weapon without a response. That was the intention. But intention is not the same as control. Then came the first major fracture. According to Guardian reporting, Saudi Arabia refused to allow the United States to use its bases and airspace for Project Freedom. That detail changed the story. Because a mission like this does not operate in theory, it operates on geography. It needs airspace. It needs bases. It needs refueling. It needs regional coordination. It needs allies who do more than agree quietly. It needs allies willing to provide infrastructure and practice. And without that, the mission becomes harder, riskier, and more exposed. This is the part Washington does not like to say out loud. The United States may have the most powerful military in the world, but even that military still needs access. If Riyadh says no, the map changes. And when the map changes, the mission changes. That is what Project Freedom revealed almost immediately. American power could announce the operation, but the region controlled part of the operating space. Saudi hesitation was not just a diplomatic embarrassment, it was a strategic warning. Riyadh wanted Hormuz open. Saudi Arabia needed oil to move. The Gulf needed shipping confidence restored. But Saudi Arabia also had to calculate what participation would cost. If U.S. aircraft used Saudi bases or airspace for Project Freedom, Iran could read Saudi Arabia as part of the operation. That could make Saudi territory a target. It could pull the kingdom deeper into a confrontation it did not want to own. And that is where the whole mission became more complicated. Washington could frame Project Freedom as humanitarian, but Iran could frame it as a military challenge. Washington could say it was protecting neutral ships, but Iran could say regional states were helping the United States break Iranian leverage. That is why Saudi Arabia's reported refusal mattered. It showed that America's allies may have wanted Hormuz open, but they did not all want to be seen helping Washington force it open. That difference is everything. Publicly, Trump gave a different reason. He said Project Freedom was being paused because Pakistan and other countries had requested restraint. He also said there had been progress toward a complete and final agreement with Iran. That was the official explanation. Diplomacy needed space. Talks were moving. A deal might still be possible. So the ship movement could wait. And to be fair, Pakistan's mediation mattered. Iran and the United States were already exchanging proposals through mediators. The pause gave Trump a way to step back without admitting that Project Freedom had run into regional resistance. But let's look at the timing. The pause came after the mission had already created real danger. Iran had warned against U.S. interference. Shipping companies were still nervous. Allies were calculating risk. Regional access had become uncertain. So yes, diplomacy was part of the explanation. But it was not the whole explanation. The official story was about talks. The structure underneath was about risk. This is where the story becomes deeper. Project Freedom was designed to show strength, but strength without support can turn into exposure. The United States was trying to force movement through a waterway Iran had made dangerous. But without full regional backing, every transit carried more risk. One drone, one small boat, one missile, one warning shot, one misread signal. That is all it takes in Hormuz. Once U.S. forces are protecting commercial vessels, any attack becomes a direct test of American credibility. If Washington responds, the conflict widens. If Washington does not respond, deterrence weakens. That was the trap. Project Freedom was supposed to restore freedom of navigation, but it risked turning every commercial transit into a possible trigger for war. And when the region was not fully behind the mission, that risk became much harder to carry. Now, hold on. Did Project Freedom fail completely? Not exactly. That would be too simple to conclude. Reports said the operation helped move some commercial vessels through the strait with U.S. support. That gave Washington something to point to. But the larger goal was never just to move one or two ships. The real goal was to restore confidence at scale. And that did not happen. Shipping companies still had to ask the hard questions. Could the United States protect every ship? Would Iran target vessels linked to U.S. partners? Would insurers cover the risk? Would this route be open tomorrow? Would the mission return next week under a more aggressive form? That is why the pause mattered. It showed that military force can open a passage for a moment. But confidence is harder to restore. And in global shipping, confidence is the real currency. The consequences showed up quickly. The Strait of Hormuz remained under pressure. Energy markets stayed nervous. The war continued to threaten global trade. And even when relative calm returned after flare-ups, the deeper conflict had not been settled. That was the contradiction. A mission had been launched to restore movement. Then it was paused. A diplomatic track was promoted, but the maritime standoff remained. Iran still had leverage. The U.S. blockade still existed. The ships still faced risk. And the world economy still had to price uncertainty into one of the most sensitive corridors on Earth. So Project Freedom did not settle the crisis. It revealed how stuck the crisis really was. Hormuz was not only a military problem, it was a political problem, an economic problem, an alliance problem, and a credibility problem all at once. South Korea's response exposed the same issue from another angle. Trump had urged Seoul to join the effort. But after Project Freedom was put on hold, South Korea suspended its review of whether to participate. That detail matters. Because South Korea has a direct interest in keeping Hormuz open, it depends heavily on energy flows from the region. So if any country had a reason to support safe passage, South Korea did. But joining a US-led operation also meant becoming visibly attached to Washington's confrontation with Iran. That was not a small decision. It carried risk. Risk to shipping. Risk to diplomacy. Risk to energy security. Risk to South Korean vessels and companies. So Seoul hesitated. And that hesitation revealed a bigger problem for Washington. Even allies that needed Hormuz open did not necessarily want to own the military mission that forced it open. At the same time, the United States tried to move the issue into the United Nations. Washington revised a proposed Security Council resolution demanding that Iran stop attacks and mining in the Strait of Hormuz. But China and Russia were still expected to veto it. But note that it matters. It matters because it shows America was constrained on more than one level. Operationally, it needed regional access. Diplomatically, it needed international backing. Strategically, it needed allies willing to share the risk. But every layer became difficult. Saudi Arabia reportedly restricted access. South Korea paused its review. China and Russia resisted the UN path. And Iran kept testing the limits of the standoff. That is how a superpower can still find itself boxed in. Not because it lacks force. Because force alone cannot solve every layer of the problem. And then the stakes rose again. After the pause, Trump criticized Iran's latest response and described the ceasefire as being on life support. That changed the mood around the pause. Because if the pause was meant to give diplomacy space, then Iran's response became the test of whether that space had produced anything real. And Trump's reaction suggested that the opening was narrowing. This is why Project Freedom did not disappear after it was paused. It became a threat in reserve, a tool that could return, a signal that the United States could step back for diplomacy but still return to the waterway if talks failed. That is why the pause did not reduce the stakes completely. It suspended the mission. It did not remove the pressure. And once talks began to stall again, the shadow of escalation returned. That is where Project Freedom Plus entered the story. Trump suggested that if talks failed, the United States could return to Project Freedom. But he did not stop there. He hinted at something he called Project Freedom Plus. He said it would mean Project Freedom Plus other things. He did not explain what those other things were. And that was the danger. The phrase left room for escalation. More ships, more aircraft, more strikes, more pressure, more direct confrontation. Maybe it was bargaining language. Maybe it was meant to push Iran back to the table. Maybe it was designed for domestic politics. But in Hormuz, words matter. Every threat changes how the other side prepares. If Iran believed Project Freedom Plus meant expanded military action, Tehran had reason to harden its position. If allies believed it meant a wider war, they had reason to hesitate even more. So what did the pause reveal? The pause revealed the limits of unilateral coercion. The United States could launch the mission. It could deploy destroyers, aircraft, unmanned systems, and thousands of personnel. It could declare safe passage. It could call the mission humanitarian. But it could not force every ally to support it. It could not make insurers trust the route immediately. It could not make Iran accept American movement through the strait. And it could not turn a dangerous corridor into a normal trade route simply by giving the operation a name. That was the lesson. Project Freedom had power, but it also had limits. And those limits appeared almost immediately. In Riyadh, in Seoul, at the United Nations, in shipping markets, and in the water itself. The pause did not make America look powerless, but it did reveal that American power still needed permission, geography, confidence, and allies. Here is the real Tradeconomics lesson. Project Freedom was not just about moving ships. It was about whether the United States could convert military power into economic certainty. That is harder than it sounds. A navy can escort a vessel, but it cannot automatically restore insurance confidence. It can challenge a blockade, but it cannot force every regional ally to accept the risk. It can announce freedom of navigation, but it cannot guarantee that one incident will not trigger escalation. It can show strength, but it cannot make markets forget that Hormuz remains vulnerable. That is why this story matters. Because Hormuz is where military power, oil prices, shipping insurance, alliance politics, and diplomacy all meet. And when one of those layers breaks, the whole mission becomes fragile. That is what Project Freedom exposed. After the pause, the stalemate continued. Iran still wanted to show that pressure on Tehran could create pressure on the world. The United States still wanted to show that no state could control an international energy corridor. Gulf states still wanted the waterway open, but they did not want to become targets. Shipping companies still wanted safe passage, but needed insurers to believe the route was manageable. China and Russia still resisted U.S. legitimacy at the United Nations. Pakistan still tried to keep the negotiation channel alive. And Trump's rejection of Iran's response kept the possibility of escalation alive. That was the battlefield beneath the battlefield. Not only ships and missiles, access, insurance, diplomacy, oil, alliances, credibility. Project Freedom mattered because it exposed all of them. So why did Trump pause Project Freedom? Publicly, because diplomacy needed space. Because Pakistan and others asked for restraint. Because there was still a possibility of an agreement with Iran. But underneath that public explanation was a harder reality. The mission was risky. Regional support was not guaranteed. Saudi access reportedly became a problem. Allies hesitated. Iran resisted. and the possibility of a wider war was getting too close. Project Freedom was meant to challenge Iran's grip on the Strait of Hormuz. Instead, it revealed that the United States could not fully control the strait without the region behind it. That is the real story. If this breakdown helped you understand what really happened behind the pause, subscribe to the channel now. Hit the like button so more people see this analysis. Share this video with someone who thinks Project Freedom was only about ships. And turn on notifications because Project Freedom Plus may be the next dangerous chapter. This is Liberation Lens, where perspective matters, and where we do not just follow the headline, we follow the power behind it.